Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fierce Awakened Woman Global Online Conference. This is a call for the gentle and brave hearted to step into your fierce awakened self, to discover your own unique gifts, to start sharing them with the world and the global village, and to really embrace the idea of a grounded sense of courage so that we can display a dynamic sense of grace. And today we have a really special guest, Dr. Scott Mills. Hi, Scott. Thank you for
Hello.
saying yes.
Of course. You're an easy yes.
Thank you. I'll take that as a really good thing to be an
Oh my God,
easy
it's
yes.
amazing. It was not even, sometimes you get invites and you're like, wow, do I want to do this thing? And there was just no hesitation in me at all. I mean, first of all, it's you. So, of course, anything you ask me to do, I'm going to say yes. And then
Thank
on
you.
top of it, you've put this extraordinary gathering of humans together, both the panelists, the speakers you've had. I'm just mind blowing. Like we were talking about Jean Shinoda Bolin, who's coming in, and all of these other extraordinary folks. I was watching who you've got on here, and then the folks who've been joining in the group. I mean, what a cool global gathering. So of course it was a yes. So,
Thank you. I love that it has a global footprint. That was one of the big intentions behind it. It
yeah.
has to be, I guess, in the world today. But let me tell everybody a little bit about you. So, Dr. Scott Mills has been working 25 years in one way or another to make the world a better place. Described as a cross between Yoda and Bill Nye, the science guy, he brings a unique perspective steeped in psychology and spirituality to everything he does. He's been a college professor, a social worker, a coach, and a mentor to people around the world. He's taught with and consulted for New York Times best-selling authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders. He started a theater company for youth and created a federal demonstration project to support kids whose parents are HIV positive and so many more things. But what he's most passionate about is about finding ways that we can collectively evolve the planet. So, welcome, Scott.
Thank you
And
so much, Jen. This is so exciting to be here and to play. And what an extraordinary time for us to be having these conversations.
isn't it? It is an extraordinary time. Like, I suppose every time could be extraordinary, but it's just been, the social justice movements, the uprisings around the world, the pandemic. It really does feel like things that aren't working in the world are starting to really come to rise up to the surface in a way that we can start thinking about this in a new way.
Yeah, and I agree that we could say any time was an extraordinary time, but really in my lifetime, there have been moments, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm nearly 50 now, um, and I can feel kind of the pulses. Right before I was born, there was Vietnam, and there was some of that coming out. We had um, a little later a like an explosion of Earth stuff for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And Earth Day got started, and I felt like there was a possibility for some change. Then we had some like the AIDS pandemic started. That again was like such a moment. Iraq for the U.S. All the stuff that happened in 9/11, and um, so these moments. Um, they don't seem to be every moment. They seem to open up, and what's been interesting to me in this one is just like what you were saying, it's not one thing. It's a convergence of so many things that have not been working that all of a sudden are becoming obvious. Part of what I love about this fiercely awakened woman is we are in the midst of the the Global Women's March, which I was part of, and it was fascinating to me that there weren't more men in that
Hmm.
because I think, and I actually had to ask someone, is it okay for me to come? Because I didn't know if it was just a women's space. Um, but I've been watching and I'm wanting more and more men to be supporting women and saying like the Me Too movement is not just about women having to protect themselves.
Right.
It's really about women having power and men behaving, and not being crazy. But we've got that extraordinary movement. We have Black Lives Matter in the US that has been so inspiring to see people in London and other, all around the world. Like I've had friends who said, "Oh, we just went to a Black Lives Matter protest in this country that
Mhm.
is, whatever, all over." And now we have this pandemic that I think, as I've talked to people around the world, the pandemic, the protests, the environmental crisis we're having, I keep hearing people say to me, the life that I've been living doesn't make sense anymore. There's got to be a change. And so, if this space we're in, it feels like, as tumultuous as it is, as filled with trauma, and I know we're going to talk a lot about trauma today because that's
Mhm.
one of my favorite things to talk about, to move through, not to talk about to stay in.
Stay.
But in this moment of trauma, there's an opportunity for extraordinary post-traumatic growth. And so I think that's the opportunity for collective evolution, where if enough of us say the way we've been living is no longer working, we need to create a new path. We need to rethink what it means to be human, what it means to be in relationship to the earth, what it means to be people who um, have spent money and consumed resources in a way that's been really destructive, um, and also like what it means to have everyone have a right to be happy and connected and full of love. Like what a different world we have a possibility to step into right now.
Right. And you and I have talked about this, and I've sat in on your workshops, and I always feel like it's the power of possibility. It's the power of choice, right? To see the possibility and to move through whatever you're working through, to acknowledge it, accept it, embrace it, and then embrace the power of possibility as the next step, right? So, and Dr. Jean Bolin the other day was talking about this liminal space that we're in with the pandemic, right? This
Hmm.
sort of between and betwixt stage where it's fairly obvious that we're not going to be able to really go back to how we were, even though we might want to be, and how we're going to move into this other thing that we're creating is still really uncertain. But how can we begin to look at the trauma that this pandemic has caused all of us, whether we acknowledge that we've been traumatized or not? Like, I think many of us are just like me, just put on your endurance backpack and kind of just get through it and move through. But I do notice that there's a lot of sadness that I have still, to deal with, that I haven't yet dealt with.
Well, I mean, still is such an interesting word because we're still in the middle of it. We're still in
Mm-hmm.
an active trauma situation. So what I've been talking about since this started is that we are living, all of us, in a trauma bath right now. Meaning like we've all jumped in the pool together. There's nowhere to escape. This is a global pandemic. It doesn't matter if you go off to a little island, if you're hiding in a country that you think doesn't have any COVID going on. It's moving through the whole world. Um, and the conditions for trauma are really clear. We've all got a sense of helplessness, because there's only so much we can do as non-scientists. We've been able to wash our hands and wear a mask, and thank goodness most of us have been doing that, but that feels like a very small action to do in the midst of this really big threat. um, we've felt powerless. We have had our lives threatened. You know, the beginning is to actually acknowledge that this has been a traumatic experience. And part of the gift here, um, is that we have not in the Western world been good about talking about trauma. We just haven't known how to do it. And so many of these movements we're seeing emerge are movements of people who've been traumatized for generations. Um, so now we have an opportunity to say, okay, well, what if we could learn how to deal with trauma in relationship to COVID, and then we could start to say, well, let's look at trauma in relationship to the experience of African Americans in the US and other countries, of women around the world who've been subjugated to just horrible experiences. We can start to move through it and at least have some kind of place to go. But the beginning is we have to start acknowledging that this has been a traumatic situation, and it continues to be and will actually be for until we can step out, without a mask, connect till life becomes a little bit more normal. And the reason I say we have to acknowledge this is because If we don't, then what we're going to try to do is step back into life as if nothing happened. And you can see this in the US right now in Miami. There's been a big, you know, surge of students who've been wanting to go for spring break because it's spring break time. And the mayors had to say, you guys, there's still a pandemic, declare an emergency for the city, send people away, close all the beaches. Um, those are people who are still in denial, and denial is sometimes useful. So I'll say some things that, I think all of our capacities in our human selves and our beings are useful. Sometimes we have to be able to deny to get through, because the magnitude of this is just so great. So I've said to folks for a year now that understanding COVID is sort of like trying to back a Mack truck into a mouse hole. We simply don't have, for most of us, the capacity to understand the implications of a global pandemic. So, so it's taken some time. It's a lot to chew on. So we'll have this first piece where we just get through it, and you're one of the lucky ones. Those of us who've been able to endure, who've had some resources, who've been able to keep work, like we've endured and maybe grown a little bit. There have been a lot of people that folks like us are going to have to acknowledge have just scraped through, if at all.
Yeah.
And on top of it, we've lost 2.5 million people around the world, half a million in the US alone. Um, there will be a lot of grief that we have yet to get to acknowledge. We're still, for many of us, we're still in that place we call the busyness of death. And we'll stay in this place. The busyness of death is something that happens when someone you care about passes away, and you have things to do like pay the bills, figure out the estate, clean out a house, plan a funeral, collect the pictures, make sure there's food for everybody, all of this stuff. So at the beginning, when someone has died, there's so much to do, and the experience, the emotional experience, doesn't hit us until we go home. Until everybody's gone, and we're sitting in our house alone, or maybe with a family member or two, but we're with our own thoughts, and we recognize and feel the loss. We have a massive amount of loss that we're going to have to feel to move through.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you to clarify some of that. Like we all come from this definition of trauma a little bit differently. Just to set sort of the context here. How are you thinking about trauma in all the ways it's showing up?
Well, you're right. There's a lot of different ways to think about trauma. What I'm fascinated by right now is whether what we're experiencing is, or what will kind of come through, is post-traumatic stress disorder, on a global scale, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a little different. Um, it's hard for me to fathom yet right now. Complex PTSD is something that usually children who've been bullied, children or people who've been subjugated to some kind of stressors for years will experience, because there's not just one stressor. There's not just one thing, um, like a loud noise may not be the only trigger. A friend of mine was telling me earlier this week that she's kind of the grandma for the neighborhood she's in, and the kids love her. They all call her grandma, the neighbor kids. And one of the kids came up the other day. They haven't been going out at all. She's had her vaccines, um, and she just hugged him out of instinct, because that's what she was used to. And the little boy that she hugged, he froze, his body stiffened. And this is one of those things that we're gonna um, have to deal with, because his body had learned that getting close to somebody, to touching, to breathing, the air they're breathing, could potentially kill him. So, of course, all of us have learned this now. And there's more subtle ways we're doing it, but I find myself doing the same thing. If somebody's walking down the street and they don't have a mask, I will walk to the other side because I don't know them. And I don't know if they have a disease I can't see. So these ways that we've been distancing from each other, and the startle response, right, that first comes up. So trauma is just in a kind of an unofficial definition for me, is an interruptive event that causes the brain to generally move into danger brain. and you've heard me talk about this before,
Right.
but we've got two nervous systems that we function out of, kind of what I call the green brain and the red brain. Um, Green brain is just parasympathetic nervous system, peaceful. It's the easiest way to think about it. Peaceful or green brain. That's the place where we see possibilities, where um, we're not fearful, we can relax, we're breathing easy. Danger brain, red brain, is where we're preparing for danger. Pretty obvious, sympathetic nervous system. We have been living with hyperactive danger brain for a year. But what happens is when we're in danger brain, when we associate something with danger, the brain learns quicker. And so it picks up these cues, like because our brains are predictive more than they're
Mhm.
reactive. So it starts to notice, like, oh, that person's getting close to me. And instead of reacting to them coming to hug you, it's the brain is reacting as they get close, imagining they might hug you, and ooh, something is going on. So we learn these things really quick, and we become hyper attuned to the danger around us. That's when I'm looking at trauma, when it has the effect of hyper attuning the brain to danger, so that, and our work, this is not that hard to unravel. It just takes a little bit of time. So the first thing I want folks to know is that when you're dealing with trauma, first of all, don't do it by yourself. Trauma is tricky in that if you think about um, a soda bottle that's gotten shaken up, like you shake the soda bottle and then you try to open it, right, it explodes. But if we take that same bottle and we give it a bigger container, same amount of stuff inside of it, there's more room for it to move. So I always want people to have room for anxiety, stress, all of this to move in a circle of other human beings. That was a little bit of what we were talking about before the
Mhm.
call, this sense of connecting beyond
Right.
ourselves. And part of that is so we create a container. Because trauma, what will happen if we do this by ourselves? And there's some things we can do to get ourselves calm, get ourselves back into green brain. But usually, if we're trying to deal with trauma on our own, we activate that red brain. We go and we become the trauma. We become the fear. We become the anxiety. Um, Kind of fascinating. In English, we say, I am fearful, I am afraid. I am angry. In Spanish, which you know well from being over in Barcelona, is, I have fear. I have anger. It's something that we can have much more of a container for. So when we're dealing with these things, if we can create containers, both in ourselves and in a circle, and I don't mean containers like to make it go away, but we could spend our lives doing trauma work. Um, and that's not going to be very healthy. We want to kind of make time for moving things um, forward, and then we want to make space to really be in the joy of life, because it's not just about the healing work and the healing journey. Um, it's a tricky one in the personal development world. The healing journey has no off ramp. Um, so people are always on a healing journey, and I always ask people, when will you be done with your healing journey? And there's never a time. So it's part of the reason that I use the notion of evolution much more than healing journey.
Well, and I love that concept because I do think it's sort of that, fall down seven times, get up eight, right? It's that moment that you say, okay, I've fallen and I've got to keep pushing through or get back up and figure it out. But I love the healing doesn't have an off ramp because we could just live in this space. So,
Yeah. And when we've fallen, if we can, instead of having to feel like every single time we have to get back up, because this is the Western mythos that we have to do it all by ourselves, we fall, we get up over and over, um, we can lift each other up. But what I want folks to notice is when you're in the fallen space, there's an opportunity to choose to stay down or an opportunity to trust. So a lot of my work is built around what I call super resilience or resilience evolved. It's the traditional phrasing for resilience is grit plus determination, right?
mhm.
I will survive. Angela Duckworth gave us that definition. There's been a lot of research. I instead say that super resilience is the capacity to trust life, to ask for what you need when you need it, to receive fully and to give without expectation. So when we're down, it may be that getting back up is impossible for a moment, that we just have to let ourselves be down. We've fallen. And sometimes we're like that old commercial, I've fallen and I can't get up.
Right.
And we need to be able to shout that out to the people in our lives and say, this is a moment where I need support. And I'm making this distinction because I think so many people think that the journey of healing, the journey of resilience is, I got to do it. I just got to keep pushing. It's a very yawn energy to this. I just got to keep pushing, pushing, pushing. And then we wonder why we're so exhausted. We wonder why we're so worn out and just hoping somebody will come along and help us. But if we start to acknowledge that we do this together, you know, it becomes so much easier because then we're in a circle watching out for each other.
Right. Well, and we were talking just before we went on too about this, leaping and the net will appear, right? But we don't have to leap without a parachute. And you made a beautiful other analogy for that. Can you share how else we can
Yeah,
jump?
yeah, I just feel like we jump together, and the if we jump the way we are now, which is okay, we can hold hands and jump together, and we'll be fine. But if we can evolve, I have this kind of image in my mind of our evolution, and everything I've been doing for the last year I've called experiments in collective evolution. So all the courses I've been teaching, the communities I've been gathering, to me, when we step into that evolution, we create our own set of wings. Like the leap isn't to leap down to the ground, it's to leap and go up. It's to move forward. So I have this image of collective evolution being us all grabbing hands in our expanded selves and just flying. There's no, oh, I've got to leap and I'll fall. That's the place of trust. And it's such an interesting place because I've been looking a lot at breath, do a lot of work with breath, and one of my favorite things to notice is that we commit an act of trust 20,000 times a day. Every time we breathe out, we expel the oxygen in our lungs. We have to trust that there will be air to replace it, right? So we have to trust that there will be another breath for us until there's not, and that's the end of life. But this place where we can just begin to connect to the flow of life and remember that we are we're part of nature, we're part of the natural order. The natural order evolves and grows as well. We're supported by that whole system all the time, instead of we little humans who seem to have made ourselves so mighty because we're alone. you know we're not. If we can start in that place as we embrace any kind of trauma work, we are not alone. That would be the beginning of such transformation. We would look across at the women standing across from us, and say to the Me Too movement, of course, I'm standing with you in every moment. I am a safe space for any woman who's been harassed, assaulted, to come and speak, and I will support you. Um, we can say to our African American brothers and sisters, we are here to support you. Like that's the I am not alone and we are not different.
Right.
We're fundamentally the same. We're the same species. We're one of the only species that doesn't see ourselves as a collective, like that we've divided ourselves out because of the color of our fur. you know I have this fantasy that at some point we'll be spotted and striped and just all kinds of different mixes, and so it would be too complicated to say, oh, the people with the purple spots and the blue dots go over here, the people with the yellow stripes. It's like, no, no, we're just all part of this beautiful bouquet of human creation. um, so to me, that's the beginning. That's where we begin to evolve. And we have to do it together. So as long as the mythos is that we must survive on our own, we must make it through, then we'll stay exactly where we are.
Yeah. Well, and I want to also bring up something I know that you talk about and teach is about, sharing your story and tuning into the story you tell yourself and the story you tell other people. And this came up in the conversation I had yesterday with Speak Trauma, which is
Mm,
using documentary filmmaking and storytelling as a way to heal trauma as well. And obviously I'm a storyteller, you're a storyteller, right? And we're all storytellers. So how do we begin to take the narrative that we keep telling ourselves, and especially in pandemic times, and say, okay, I'm down and I need support, and here's another version of my story that
Okay,
I'm going
so
to live.
there's two layers to this. The
Mm-hmm.
first is you want to be careful where and when you tell your story, because sometimes telling your traumatic story is a way of reliving it over and over and over again. There's huge power in it, so I'll get there in a second. But what I usually do is I make a distinction between the structure and the story. Maybe that's where I used the word structure earlier and got
Sorry. Yeah.
lost my own train. It's just early and I've been moving. So, so um, so the structure of the story is the emotions, the feelings, the experience we have that's separate from the details. So if I think about the pandemic, right, and you had mentioned this earlier, like there's sadness in you. That is a structure without saying I am sad because X, Y, and Z. Um, so usually what I'll do is I'll work with the structure first because it's less likely to re-trigger. Um, if I tell somebody, oh my gosh, just think about this. If you had a crazy incident, maybe you're on the bus in Barcelona and something happened, and you felt like anxious, and you go home and you tell your partner, oh my gosh, I was on the bus and this thing happened. Before you finish the story, often you can feel the tension in your body come back because you've relived it a little bit. So for first layer, we want to be able to be with the emotions in a way that feels safe. What a lot of us do, and this is a little bit of what I was mentioning earlier, is we become the emotion of anger or anxious or sad. So we want to be able to sit with sad, angry, anxious without it being consuming. So essentially what we do is we make sure that we've got our parasympathetic nervous system running, always running, but we want it to be driving. Um, and we can sit with the emotions. There's some tools we use for that so that they become safe. So that's usually the first layer. And then the storytelling piece is so brilliant. I had the opportunity to work in an art therapy community years ago, and I also have done tons of theater work with kids, creating their own stories. And part of what's fascinating, whether you're telling a story visually using art on a piece of paper, writing, and putting the words into something, um, we're creating a container outside of ourselves to be able to work the story in a safe way. So if I have a piece of paper in front of me and I start to draw, or I start to write the story, I have the option to put that piece of paper away. So I can put it in a desk drawer, I can leave it when I need to, which is actually really powerful. And as soon as we get it outside our body onto this page, now we have some capacity to be an observer of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what I love doing, and I think you've seen me do this technique, but I love having people tell the story from different perspectives because it just gets the brain to move more into the green brain, the curiosity. Because if we start telling this story and we say, so there we were in the midst of COVID and we were the victims for a year and a half. We suffered, we struggled, we thought we would never make it through, and our lives were destroyed, right? That's one version of the story, and there's truth in that. There are people whose lives will never be the same. I mean, all of us will never be the same, but particularly people who've lost loved ones, um, their lives will not be the same, and it's a horrible loss. Um, we can take the same story and we can start to tell the story from the perspective of surviving. Like we were survivors. Where did we grow? Where did we learn? Where did we get curious? What did we notice we no longer needed to carry with us? Again, there's no right answer. The trick here is to allow yourself to have enough distance to work with the story so that you can basically, um, how would I say this? So when we get enough distance, the story doesn't consume us. We don't become the story. We begin to see the story. And then when the story gets reincorporated into our lives, when we bring it back in, if we've moved the story on paper from victim to survivor, there's a way that it starts to ripple out into the rest of our lives. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then does the story reshape itself to how we evolved, not just survived or
It
thrived?
depends what you do with the stories.
Mm-hmm.
So you have so many options here. I mean, one of the interesting options would be, if you were going to do this in a writing workshop, and I would always suggest if you are experiencing significant trauma, and I should say this, at the beginning of a call, but if you're experiencing significant trauma, don't do these exercises by yourself. Um, do them in a community and do them with a licensed professional or someone who's a specialist in trauma work. Um, Especially if you've had a lot of trauma. But there's a lot of techniques we can do with folks. One of them would be simply to move forward in time. Tell the
Mm-hmm.
story from different points in your evolution, your own personal evolution. And what often happens for us is we have these experiences where we look back 10 years later and we think, wow, that changed me. But right in the middle of it, it's a little too hard to go, oh, this is the version of me evolved, because it's, you're still kind of in a traffic jam. I'll tell you a funny example of this. So I went to grad school very young. Kind of I didn't take any breaks. So I think kind of towards the end of grad school, I was still an actor in LA, and had an agent and was getting calls for auditions. And I thought I wanted to be an actor, sort of. I was also doing a PhD, but I got an audition call right towards the end of my acting career for Power Rangers in Space. And I thought about, maybe I'll go to this. This would be good. You have to go to every audition your agent sends you to. But I just sat with it and I was like, this is not who I want to be. I just spent, 6 years working in grad stuff, um, in undergrad, all of these, studies. It's like, this is not who I want to be. So I made a choice to leave LA and go to DC and start this theater company and do some work with kids who had really significant issues. I was doing a lot of HIV prevention work at the time, and that theater company was called Youth Acting Against AIDS. Um, but it's fascinating. If I would have looked in the middle of that story, I could have been making the biggest mistake of my life, because maybe taking that audition would have led to a big role and then I would have been in whatever. It took 10, 15 years to look back at that and go, my gosh, thank goodness I made that choice, because I would not be doing what I've been doing right now. And the work that I've been doing and I've been gathering really brilliant folks to help me do has been helping people get through this pandemic. I wouldn't have had these tools. So if we want to play with the story, it helps to project forward significantly. There I am 10 years, 20 years later, and looking back at all the lessons that I learned from COVID, the way that my life changed. Um, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think it adds a layer or perspective that we may not see because, of course, there's a lot of conversation about coming back into the present moment, right? Be here now, be right here. And sometimes being right here, right now is really hard work. It's-
Yeah, and it's a little, it's so funny. So many of these phrases have become like the answer, and none of these are the answer. They're a tool in your tool belt. So be here now. Yes, of course. I teach presence in everything that I do. Every course you ever take with me, there's an element of what it's like to choose to be present. But there's also strategic dissociation, and it's useful. And we do it all the time. So when you're in line at the bank, and you have a choice to be here now and be with the fact that you're waiting there in line and there's nobody's talking to you and everybody's looking at their phone, or doing whatever. That's not a very exciting be here now place, right? But if in that same moment I can be, I'm going to imagine the chapter of the book I'm working on. I'm going to imagine being on the next trip I'm planning, or whatever. I'm going to imagine going home and making dinner and spending a nice evening with friends. These are all really useful things to do. I'm using a really light example, um, where we daydream. We That's all dissociation. Daydreaming is not being here now. It's allowing our minds to wander, to play, and to explore. Now, that's useful, and we can choose to do that at even more strategic level when things get too big, right? We can choose to dissociate from painful experiences temporarily. Now, where we get into trouble is when we go, I'm never going to deal with this again. I'm going to push this away. One of my friends, Dr. Lori Layden, has people do a little box in their minds, and she said, put this in your in this little box in your mind until it's safe to work on again. And usually that means with a community, with a container of time. Time is also a useful container. Like I will only work on this trauma work in this space for this amount of time. And then I'm going to step out of it. I'm going to take a walk. I'm going to take a cold shower. I'm going to do something that breaks that energy and brings me into a different state. Um, so that level of being here now, you do not want to be here now all the time, um, in such a painful place. Like you can choose to pop in and out.
And I
So,
think, yeah, I think just the image of that, right? Like put that in a little box and say, okay, here I am. You know, this is what I know has to come up. I have to kind of deal with whatever. In my case, I said the word sadness, right?
mm-hmm.
And I don't even know if I have the bigger picture of it yet because I don't know if I haven't yet taken it out of the box and said, "Oh, let me think about what this sadness has done for me," right? Or where it's coming from even because I don't even know if it's pandemic. I think it might even be more than that in some way. But I like that we can put these little we can we can self empower ourselves to say, "I'm going to deal with this now," and say, yeah, okay, I'm going to confront it and deal with it, and then I'm going to put it in my box. I'm going to go take a shower and live the rest of my life and come back to it at another
Yeah.
time. It's not a 24-hour thing that we always have to keep ourselves in, I guess.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think that we need that because just like we sleep, right? There's cycles of the body, and the body is not designed to spend 24/7 working through your trauma. And in fact, it's a little bit. I'll go back to this healing story thing we talked about at the beginning of the call. There's this notion for so many people that they have been traumatized, which is so true for all of us. During COVID, if you had any experience of trauma, and obviously some people have much deeper traumas. They've been sexually assaulted, abused, like so many things. Like I've worked with people in who've grown up in war-torn countries. That's a lighter level of trauma than other things. But sometimes we have these traumas, and then folks dedicate their lives to healing from them. And our identities become wrapped around the healing journey. And I'll often ask people, who will you be when you no longer need to heal? Um, and it's a question that folks usually don't have an answer for. And it's fascinating to me because, in my work, I actually start in a different place. I have an assumption that nobody's broken. So while you may be bruised and you may need time to rest, you're not broken, you're whole. And every person I work with, I'm working to see, and it's working is an exaggeration. It doesn't take any work to do this. As I'm sitting across from them, I'm seeing the Buddha nature in them. I'm seeing the Christ consciousness, the spirit, the source, whatever you want to call this word, but I'm seeing the wholeness in them. Is the foundation of what I'm doing. And what I find fascinating is if I can see the wholeness in you, you can often begin to recognize the wholeness in yourself, because I'm not looking at you to try to fix you. I'm just being with you. And sometimes there's some things you're working on, you want to change. It's not saying the perfection in you, but the wholeness in you. And what I love inside of that is for most of us who've decided that we have to be on a healing journey, and I did this when I was younger. I had a kind of crazy childhood in some ways, and also beautiful in some ways, but there were some things to work out. Um, when you make the assumption that all of life is about being on a healing journey, you never get to have a break and you're constantly looking for the ways you're damaged. But if you make the assumption that you're whole fundamentally, about 98% of you is probably going to be okay. And about 2% of you is going to be that part that's still experiencing some tension, some pain, some difficulty. But when we say, okay, my whole life is about the healing journey, often what we do is we choose to fully inhabit that 2% and ignore the 98% of us that's okay. Like for someone like you have some sadness. And one of my questions would be to notice even if it's your sadness. because we're a collective, right? We co-regulate to our other humans all the time, and when we have had 2.5 million people die in this short a period of time, um, there's going to be a lot of sadness. There's going to be sadness from kids who can't go to school right now and can't be with their friends. There's sadness from grandparents who can't be with their grandchildren, right? So the sadness may or may not be yours. Um, but you can sit in that space and go, okay, yeah, so there's some sadness, and there's an extraordinary partner that I love being with, and I live in this beautiful home, and I get to do work that I love, and I have good friends. You have your health. Like, these are, if we can sit in that space, and from that space then take the little sadness box out and go, okay, let's bring it over into this place of wholeness. It doesn't mean that we're not addressing it. It just means we're addressing it from a place of resource rather than a place of depletion.
And I think that idea of being able to resource that from that more centered place instead of, oh, I'm so exhausted and now let me look at my sadness through that filter or depletion or whatever's knocked me over the head today or whatever. I think that's part of being fierce right now, right? Like,
Yeah.
in all the different ways we can divine or define fears, like, what does it even mean to each of us? And I do think it's this like coming back and resourcing from our own inner wisdom and saying, look, yeah, 2% of me is bruised. Okay.
Yeah. And I'm going to keep pushing in a circle
Yeah. In a
because it is
circle. Yeah.
so much easier. Like, and I'm pushing this because this is something the personal development world has just made it all about me. When
Mm-hmm.
I am the whole meaning making map for myself, the world is very small. Like, it's my resources, it's my, let me come to my wisdom. I would much rather say, let me sit with Jenn, let me sit with some of these extraordinary guests that are on this call, whether we say anything or not, and just sit in the space of our own wholeness and see the wholeness of each other. Because then that little thing that was 2% of you being held by 5, 6 people, that becomes so small. Just this tiny little piece. It's interesting. In every course I teach right now, we do an exercise. We do these breakout groups. We're really interactive, and I always have people start the same way. We get into the breakout group, and if there's, no matter how many of us there are in the group, if you are the receiver for the first circle, I'll always say to you, I see you, Jenn. And my invitation is for you to take a breath, to allow yourself to be seen, and then just say back, it's so good to be seen. Um, that little circle, it's very subtle and small, and people think, oh, you're just saying, oh, it's good to see you, it's good, it's so good to be seen. It's so funny because so many people, when I say I see you, Jenn, like when I really see you. Now, if I just do it like it's a, hey, how are you, which is how we do a lot of things, like, oh, good, 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 right? Everybody's good or busy, right? That's not seeing you at all. But if I really like, that's the place, when if I become present to Jenn in front of me and I take in all of you, I may feel that sadness. I might not have a name for it. But when I fully see you, you get to relax a little bit. You get to have a sense of belonging and connection. And for all of this work we're doing, when we belong, our nervous systems relax, our being relaxes. We just go, oh, we are pack animals, right? We do not do so well by ourselves. This is part of why I just keep pushing this with people. We're designed to be communal. Like, it's just everything in us. Sometimes we go away to learn, or to meditate, something like that. We always come back to our community for thousands and thousands of years. But the mythos we've written in this last 50 to 100 years is like, no, no, we stay out there in the wild by ourselves. That's never been the case for humans. So if we can see each other, if we can gather, all of a sudden, I can hold your sadness with you. Our circle can hold your sadness with you. And by the way, I can share my sadness with you, and we can feel the connection with each other. Mary Oliver in The Wild Geese says, show me your despairs and I'll show you mine. It's one of my favorite poems. This just this this is we meet in our humanity, um, but the important part is we meet, right? We see each other, we meet, we connect, and we hold for each other those things that are difficult to hold ourselves.
Yeah, the belonging. And in that spirit, would you like to take a couple questions from
Oh
our
yeah.
circle that's here today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I shared this with you before, but my preference is if folks can share so I can hear you.
Right.
One of the things that I know, and this is always an interesting thing to ask yourself, is that usually when people ask me something, they're not asking me um, whatever the questions, the words are. It's usually coming from, different versions of ourselves. I think about we've got a survival self. So sometimes I get questions like, how can I survive? We've got a human self, which is usually more about comfort. We've got this evolutionary self. So it's hard for me to tell where it's coming from and what you're really asking if I can't hear your words. But if you can't get on a audio, feel free to put a question in the chat and I'll do my best.
Yeah, if anybody would like to come over and ask a question, just put it in the chat, or I guess that would be the fastest way to see it. Just say yes if you want to come over and ask a question.
It's so funny. When I taught third graders, there's always this place in in the beginning of when you ask people to raise their hands or ask a question where everybody's like, who's
Uh,
gonna go first? And it's so fun. So when I teach these bigger courses, usually what I do is at the very beginning I have people share anything. Like so this is like a fun teaching trick, but even if it's like share your favorite color out loud, like so somebody has gone first, because it's always this tricky space. And
it
we just may
is.
not have any
And
questions.
we may not. You may
I
have.
may have done such a good job
That's
explaining
right.
everything in the most complex topic for humanity that well, while we're waiting, yeah, why don't I would love to share one, like, because I know folks have gotten fascinated by these conversations, and so I want to share like a way that people can kind of stay in a conversation that's nothing you have to buy. And you're going to be on this. We just talked before the
Yeah,
call, but
I was so surprised. I'm like, yes, of course, because it's you. And
oh,
of
thank you.
course I would do anything for you too in that same
Yeah.
vein.
So you're going to be a guest. So I do a weekly live podcast called Human Evolutionaries Live, and I bring in some of the most extraordinary people who are leaders in their field, experts, just phenomenal. We've had, you know, award-winning filmmakers, therapists, grief therapists, like just all kinds of folks, and the list goes on and on. And you're going to come on and talk more about this journey around the world. So that's called Human Evolutionaries. And if folks are wanting to be more in the conversation, um, we frame this in a way that sometimes you listen to a podcast or you go to an event. It's part of the way I love the way Jenn has done this, um, where you feel like everything's a sale. Nobody sells anything on my podcast. We have conversations, and our goal is to be the table at the cafe that's having that conversation that you wish you were at, that you kind of lean your ear into, and you're like, and of course the point for us is that if we see you leaning your ear in, we're going to be like, come join the conversation.
Right.
It's not to be the cool kids you don't get to talk to. It's to be like, yeah, let's bring more people in. So we always go places that are somewhat unexpected, somewhat surprising. And I listen to the podcast afterwards, and I have not had one experience where I haven't gone, wow, that was so insightful. um the guests just have share so much amazing stuff. So I'd love for people to join us in that.
And where are you broadcasting? I know you're on like Spot. You're on all
Everywhere.
everywhere,
Yeah, so
right?
we're on Spotify, we're on iTunes, so you can listen now to a bunch of them. I think um we're on like 5 or 6 more of them. I'm just going to say the two I know for sure, because those are the links I always share, and then my team shares others. Yeah. So it looks like there's no
It looks
questions,
like there
but
are no
Jenn,
questions.
yeah,
No.
do you
Well,
anything else I can do with
you've
you?
solved the mysteries of the world, Scott. Just amazing how that
Uh,
works.
yeah,
But okay,
that's so funny.
just a reminder, it was the Human Evolutionaries podcast,
Yeah,
right?
and you just go to bit.ly/human evolutionaries
Mm-hmm.
if you want to come in to be part of the live chat. That's the part that's really fascinating. The interviews themselves are amazing, but we do each and every one of those live so that people can ask questions afterwards. We don't record that part, so it's kind of like coming backstage after the concert,
Oh,
and
that's
you get to
awesome.
ask these extraordinary people whatever. And they've been so generous with their time and their energy. And most of the folks who've been on have been friends of mine that I've met over the years in this wacky world of social work, teaching, personal development.
Awesome.
So,
And where else, tell people where else they can find you, your website.
oh, yeah, you can always go to my website, which is scottwmills.com. Um, and that one's easy, or you can find us on Facebook. We have a group called Human Evolutionaries. Super active. Folks
Yeah,
are
super active.
mostly healers who are really working to create a new model for what it looks like to be healers in the world. Um, it's quite an exciting group.
Great. Well, thank you, Scott. Thanks for saying yes.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Of course. How could I not invite you? Well, thank you, everybody, and thanks for joining the Fierce Awakened Woman Global Online Conference. And I'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone.